I start using like words that are way too simple, it's just because I'm kind of in a mode right now. Okay, so Apollotics. So Apollotics, affected and created by Apollo. That's what I'm going to talk about today. And it's really a talk built around this crappy portmanteau, because that's just smashing two words together. And like 2 months ago, I just thought this was hilarious, and then I ended up having to give a talk about it. So here we go. Right. So the Apollo program. So it was the third U.S. human spaceflight program after Mercury and Gemini, and Apollo's Greek god, light, music, and the sun. And I found this really funny quote where a NASA manager said, "I was naming the spacecraft like I named my baby," which I was like, I don't know. I felt like that needed to be shared. He eventually made something a little more public sounding. He was like, Apollo riding his chariot seems appropriate for how big of a program this is, and that's a little bit better. Okay, and kind of like a little more technically, right, it's a third program. It ran for about 11 years, mostly in the 60s. It had 15 named missions, and it landed the first humans on the moon. So politics, basic definition is just activities associated with the governance of a country or area, and particularly the debate or conflict among individuals who want power. So I decided that this portmanteau means the debate and conflict among those who are trying to achieve power with the Apollo program and human spaceflight in general. So let's go. Okay, so first, the Eisenhower presidency. Eisenhower is the president kind of leading up to the Apollo program, and just to give some historical context, these are the types of things that are going on. So we have the domino theory proposed, where Eisenhower says if South Vietnam falls to communism, so too would all the nations of Southeast Asia. So there's this kind of fear of communism spreading. We have the Warsaw Pact, where this kind of Soviet bloc is starting to form. Soviets launched Sputnik, so they're the first into space, and that kind of freaks everyone out. NASA is formed for the very first time, and we have the Cuban Revolution, which is communism really close to home. So there's a lot of things that are kind of going on this time, in international politics that are kind of affecting this. And so in 1960, there's the U-2 incident where a CIA spy plane shot down. The National Front for the Liberation of Vietnam, so the Vietnamese rebels, communist rebels, form as a group, and JFK is elected in 1960. So this is all to show that, after all, the Apollo program was just a battle in the Cold War. So the Apollo program was kind of the product of a lot of different factors all weaving together to kind of make it make sense for the government to spend, what is now around $270 billion on, sending someone to the moon. There was a lot of things working together, and it's just a small part, or a large part, I'd say, but a part of the larger kind of Cold War that was going on. So yeah, the nation is falling behind communist countries in science and technology. Fidel Castro, a close ally of the Soviet Union, is heightening fears of communist subversion in the Western Hemisphere. And more than half the American people kind of think war with the Soviet Union is inevitable. So Kennedy used this kind of fear, and he drove home, he emphasized the idea that he thought there was a missile gap that the Eisenhower administration wasn't really addressing, and that the U.S. was weak, and that it was because of the Eisenhower administration not focusing on building enough missiles. And he kind of used that kind of political leverage to get himself elected. So his whole campaign promised American superiority. So he becomes president, and on April 12th, 1961, a couple months into his presidency, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first person in space, and he's a Russian cosmonaut who does a full orbit around the Earth in a tiny craft, or a spacecraft called Vostok 1. And so 23 days after Gagarin, we finally get someone up there, and it's not even in orbit. So on May 5th, we have Alan Shepard. We just kind of shoot him up, and it's a ballistic trajectory, which means he just kind of went up and came down. It's the equivalent of shooting him out of a cannon. We didn't even really get any cool orbital space things. We just kind of touched space and came down. So Americo's second. Oof, that sucks. We don't like that. That's just something that was super not good. So Kennedy, 20 days after this first spaceflight, sensed the humiliation and fear on the part of the American public. And it wasn't only this, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened, and it was a total embarrassment. So he asked his Vice President Johnson, he's like, what do I do? How do we win a space race with the Soviets? Because the space race could have been, it could have been the first person in space, and if that was the end of it, we lost. So that's not what we wanted. We wanted it to be something far enough away that we could actually beat them, because the Soviets were ahead right now. They had better technology and could push into space more quickly. So it needed to be something that was far enough away that we would have time to actually surpass them. So, it could have been a space station just around Earth, or it could have been just orbiting the moon, or it could be landing a person on the moon. So they decided that landing a person on the moon was the best thing they could do. It was far enough away that they could actually win. And so one of the last major political acts was the Cold War was born, and Kennedy addresses Congress and says, now it's time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways holds the key to the future of Earth. And he says that in a less congressional way, a year later at Rice University, and has that famous quote, we choose to go to the moon this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, because they're hard. So by late 1962, we've started the Apollo program, but everyone's kind of mad at each other. So in NASA, we have that kind of bubble on the top left, and there's Wernher von Braun on the top left in the NASA bubble. So he's one of the he's Marshall Space Flight Center director. We have someone whose first name is, or their middle name I think, is Brain Nerd. It's literally Brain Nerd. It's one N, it's not two, but still. Brainerd Holmes, and he's the associate administrator for manned spaceflight. He's the one on the top right there. We have George Mueller, who's the head of manned spaceflight, right there on the bottom left. And we have James Webb, who's pretty famous, and that's who the James Webb Space Telescope is named after. He's the head administrator. So then, on the bottom right here, we have the White House. So obviously we have JFK. President, we have Jerome Wiesner, who's a science advisor, and then we have the American public right there. So Wiesner was kind of mad at JFK because he thought that human spaceflight was a really high-risk enterprise with a low chance of success. So he thinks that it's less valuable than just scientific results, and it was too risky to kind of pin this much national prestige on getting human spaceflight to work. And so Kennedy kind of accepted a little bit of what he was saying, but he really focused and committed to conducting a space program that had human spaceflight. He was really more interested in human spaceflight than his predecessor. So the science advisor is mad at the president. A couple people are mad at James Webb. So people are mad at James Webb because NASA selected something called a lunar orbit rendezvous mode for how we were going to get to the moon. And so this was proposed by the science advisor, because the science advisor thought that that was too risky for the crew, because once you send them to the moon and you're doing things around the moon, you can't do anything to save them if something goes wrong. Another mode they were considering was a Earth orbit rendezvous. So things were kind of going around the Earth, and they assembled a spacecraft in orbit, and then they can fly from there. And that was a little bit safer, he thought, for the crew. And then Wernher von Braun also wanted that because he wanted to kind of focus more on the space station, and also if they were doing that kind of work, it would ensure that his NASA center would have work for a long, long time. So he's a center director, so he wants to kind of hold the work into something that his center does. So he's a little bit mad. So then, Werner von Braun is also mad at Mueller, because Mueller wants to test everything at once. He's like he's a military man who just wants it to go really quickly, and he's really focused on getting the timetable down and the cost down. Whereas Werner von Braun wants to test every little piece of everything, and all the things they order from contractors, get to the Marshall Space Flight Center, and all his engineers take apart every single thing and check every single piece. And this Mueller's like, we need to go, like we need to test all this at once. Which actually led to a really risky testing schedule that happened to end up working, but so they were mad at each other. And then Holmes was labeled, this guy, so brain nerd up here, is so he was labeled the Apollo Czar by Time magazine, and Webb was pretty pissed because he's the administrator of NASA, and it seems rude that he got undercut there. And even further, he undercut Webb's authority and headquarters authority by directly asking Kennedy for more money, getting Kennedy confused about who was actually in charge and what was actually going on. And he even said to Time magazine, the major stumbling block of getting to the moon is James Webb. He won't fight for our program. So they were understandably pretty mad at each other. James Webb's mad at Kennedy because Kennedy wants to make Apollo the top priority for everything, but if you tell a contractor that their project is top priority and needs to get done because the government says so, they're going to be like, oh man, like, we need more workers, like, we need a lot more overhead, this seems pretty important, and James Webb is really losing, he's losing out when Kennedy is pushing the fact that this is so important and giving the contractors all this leverage, which is driving up costs. And the American public is starting to get a little disillusioned with spending all this money, and even Kennedy is like, frankly, I don't really care that much about space, and like, we really need something here. And NASA internally has a lot of strife going on, where all the scientists want to do science, and they want to tweak their instruments and do exactly what they want, and then the engineers just want to send a mission up, and the scientists keep changing everything all the time, and they just want to design a payload and launch it. And they're all just bickering back and forth at each other. And of course, everyone still hates Russia. So, right. So that's that's a constant. I feel like one reminder was good. So there's this meeting that goes on in November 21st, and Wisner, the science advisor, is like, we don't know anything about the surface of the moon. Like, we don't even know if it's going to explode when we bring it back in the capsule, in the lunar module. So we're like putting something down on the moon, and it could be very different than we think it is. And JFK is like, I don't want to spend $6 or $7 billion on this. On science, no matter what schedule we're doing, because he's really focused on, on the prestige and getting there. And he's even worried that the American public or the government doesn't want to fund it, unless there's military application. So he's really focused, like NASA wants science to be done, and he, has other goals. So, after this meeting, nothing happens for 2 years. And so this is kind of bad because unless the Russians do something dramatic, there's no fear in the public heart. There's no reason to be spending so much money on, getting to the moon in such an accelerated schedule before the end of the decade. If, there's no fear, they need to feel something. And there's going to be an attack on the budget because of this. So at this point, they're spending, they want $5.7 million in 1964. And everyone's like, this is ridiculous. New York Times, like, we don't really think that going to the moon has been sufficiently explained. Like, we don't know why we're doing this. Former President Eisenhower, who's still held in really high public regard, thinks it's dumb, thinks it's nuts. And, a bunch of congressional Republicans are like, if there's no vital security at stake, if there's no military defense aspect of this, then I don't know why we need to rush. And so unsurprisingly, Kennedy is concerned about re-election, and so most Americans preferred, something about air or water pollution or job training for unskilled workers to spend all this money on instead of space, which makes a lot of sense. So one thing that Kennedy proposed in 1990 or 1962 was working together. So we have, he goes and talks to the USSR and kind of proposes this idea of, instead of racing to the moon, coming together as two programs and getting there together so they can spend less money, ease tensions. There's cost benefits, of course, because you're not duplicating effort, and technological gains from sharing. Because at this point, Kennedy was really interested in kind of like resolving the tension instead of just like, having to fight over everything. And it seemed like the USSR was actually poised to accept his proposal. But then he's not president anymore. So that's sad. But yeah, so Johnson steadfastly pursued the Gemini and Apollo programs, and he kind of promoted them as Kennedy's legacy. And so an interesting factor in all this is that, so funding was really uncertain until Kennedy died. And then all of a sudden it became about preserving his legacy and like really pushing for, memorializing him. And in a way it actually kind of ensured that it got funding and made it. Yeah. Also, one funny quote I found is whenever Johnson was trying to fundraise, he'd go around Congress and he'd say, "Now, would you rather have us be a second-rate nation, or should we spend a little money?" Which I just thought was classic. Okay, so the Russians are working. They're working on a spaceflight program. So one of the things they have is the Buckshot program. So in October of '64, they have the first spacecraft with 3 people in the crew, and it's the first space flight in a shirt-sleeve environment, which just means they're not wearing a suit. It's mostly because suits didn't fit. It really was not safe enough for them to not be wearing suits, but they needed to fit 3 people in there, and they couldn't do that with suits, so they just kind of flew without them. Yeah. So also, then there's Buckshot 2 a little bit later, and so there's the first EVA, and this also had some problems. So when the cosmonaut tried to get back in, his suit was too inflated, so he had to like depressurize his suit, like kind of poke a hole in it and like let air out to get back in, and so that was like super dangerous. And then like later, the spacecraft got flooded with like 45% pure oxygen, and like they didn't hit their target landing area, and a lot of stuff happened, but they made it down, so that's good. And yeah, this was described by historian Aziz Siddiqui as the absolute zenith of the Soviet space program. Spoiler alert. So then Gemini is happening, Project Gemini, which is the project before Apollo. And so there's a couple of firsts here. The first orbital maneuver by a crewed spacecraft. So the orbit was changed by the crew. First docking between 2 spacecraft. First American EVAs, and really built up spaceflight experience for the Apollo astronauts. So Apollo transformed NASA, it really inflated it into this new beast of a massive administration. I gotta keep going because I put 70 slides in a 20-minute presentation. So the Outer Space Treaty is politics. So one thing that happened during this time as well is people decided on the peaceful use of outer space, kind of, because there's no nukes, but you can put anything else in, any other weapons in space as long as it's not on the moon. So, kind of a treaty. So there were some setbacks though. So in Apollo 1, really unfortunately, the entire crew died in a fire on on the launch pad, and NASA performed its own investigation, and there was an electrical spark in a pure oxygen environment. They just had no chance. And so actually, this led to James Webb eventually resigning. So one thing that he did to kind of keep the program going is absorb a lot of the political damage from this incident. So he got grilled by Congress, and this is the origin of the phrase "never a straight answer" for NASA's acronym. So yeah, Soyuz 1, the number 1 was unlucky, although Apollo 1 was named afterwards. But whatever. Soyuz 1 was meant to dock with Soyuz 2 and had several problems, and eventually led to the first in-flight spaceflight fatality. So there were some other Apollo missions, leading up to the important ones, where they're testing the Saturn V rocket and lunar modules. USSR is on our tail. They have a circumlunar flight on March 2nd, although this one blew up coming back into orbit. Although the official announcement said they blew it up because they meant to do that from the beginning. There's another Zond mission, which is just another name for the Soyuz capsule, or Soyuz spacecraft. And they have a circumlunar flight with tortoises, and this one's funny because they played audio from the spacecraft, like fake audio. So NASA spent forever trying to figure out if they'd already sent a living person to a circumlunar flight, but it was just tortoises, and then they played radio signals. So Apollo 7 is our first crewed mission to have live TV broadcast back. So this is a screenshot from one of the broadcasts, and it was a virtually flawless mission. So it's really paving the way for the U.S. to continue for a bigger lunar mission. Soyuz 3, they want to rendezvous with Soyuz 2 and actually do it this time. And they got within 40 meters, but Wikipedia is pretty mean. It says the pilot screwed it up, basically, which might be true, but I didn't want to write that in text for some reason. Alright, so Apollo 8 has the first circumlunar flight and has this really famous photo called Earthrise that I really like. I bought a painting of it for my brother. And so it was originally just going to be around Earth, but they were a little bit scared by some Soviet intel, and so they semi-last minute made it into a circumlunar flight. And so this is when Apollo kind of transforms from being a lot of promise about what we're going to do and going to the moon to delivering and actually going to the moon. Alright, so Nixon gets in just in time for the good stuff. Apollo 9, so we have the full spacecraft finally flying and going into moon orbit. So Apollo 10 is the dress rehearsal, so all the astronauts in here got to do everything except land on the moon. So the lunar module gets really close and then it just comes back up. So the US still didn't know what was happening with the Soviet program, and it turns out that their rocket wasn't working and it blew up on their launch pad, and they were basically out of the game at this point. But we were still working hard. And so here it is, Apollo 11. So first moon landing, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, also classic. And so this was witnessed by at least 1/5 of humans on Earth, which is just mind-boggling. And so the computer they have to launch these rockets at 4 kilobytes of RAM. So your iPhone has 4 gigabytes of RAM, and if you look at the prefixes, that's a million. That's a million difference, which is crazy. Yeah, so that's one. If you've seen this picture around, that's because it was about 50 years ago, plus or minus 2 days for this date, for the 50th anniversary of Apollo. So after Apollo 1, we have some more missions. They land. There's first color TV, extended stay. There's a rover, the roving vehicle. I love this picture. And we got a geologist on the moon because we were only finding moon rocks, so it's good that we actually got a geologist there. And then it just became space stations mostly. So this is a Russian space station, the first space station, the Salyut 1 laboratory in April of 1971. We have Skylab. which is a U.S. project, and then finally the International Space Station, which is mostly a product of the space shuttle. The space shuttle kind of condemned us to staying in Earth orbit because it was reusable-ish, but it just couldn't go that far. So it was really good for building things like the space station and the Hubble Space Telescope. But when we sunk so much money into that program, we were never going to also be going extremely far with human spaceflight. So what did Apollo do? We got a nice gold star. We won the space race. That was pretty good. Feels good. I wasn't alive for any of this, but I like that we won it. And so it ironically demonstrated the superiority of a free market system by organizing a tremendous amount of public resources. But then a vast, centralized, government bureaucracy. But that's funny. But there's no, there's no moon base, because once we reached this focused goal of getting to the moon, that was like kind of it. That was all that was in the book. So the rest of the Apollo missions got canceled, and there just wasn't the interest. I mean, when Apollo 11 happened, barely half the people approved of it. And then right after Apollo 11, people were again like, nah, maybe that was kind of dumb. It also had an impact on environmentalism here on the Earth. So when we can finally turn around and see the Earth as small and fragile as it is, people kind of had a new perspective and wanted to preserve it a little bit more. And so this kind of iconic blue marble image from one of the later Apollo missions really kind of became an image for that cause. Human space flight. One thing that we're working on now, that NASA's working on now, is the Artemis program that I'm not going to talk about too much because Jacob has informed me that's going to be talked about later. And also, if you're a Japanese fashion billionaire, you can pay Elon Musk to send you and a couple friends around the moon. So that's dope.
It worked for me.
And that's my talk.
Got time for some questions?
After the landing, the Apollo 11 astronauts were put in medical isolation. At the same time, they took samples of lunar soil and exposed the lunar soil to rabbits, mice, beavers, all kinds of animals, bacteria, and plants. And luckily, there was no indication anything went wrong. I'd never been able to find out what the plan was. What if the bacteria had all died due to the lunar soil? What would they do with the 3 astronauts? They never heard what the plan was to be. I'd never been able to find that out.
Presumably they bury them. Oh, sorry. The question was, they put the Apollo astronauts in isolation when they got back because they didn't know if there would be any bacteria or something that would cause them to be sick, and we didn't want that spreading. Spreading moon sickness. He asked me what we would have done if it had actually been a problem, or how we would have dealt with them, and what we would have done with the astronauts. And so I cheekily said we'd bury them, but I don't really know. It's probably one of those things that's like we find out about a lot later, like the speech that was ready for in case the Apollo astronauts didn't make it back. That's something I've never thought to research, but it's a good question.
Or was he fed that line by NASA?
So, she asked if Neil Armstrong's famous first line was fed to him, and I think no. I think he thought of it himself. I think he asked some people about it, but I don't think he was given that line. I think maybe he told people about it, but I also very much might be wrong. I'm 22 years old.
So you mentioned how Kennedy's that actually maybe sort of helped push the Apollo program forward? Do you have any speculation how it wasn't killed? Do you think
This one right here, I
it's
can
similar?
tell. So we would have gone. Is this subverted?
So, yeah, I think we would have gone to the moon. I think that,
Well, down to
I think a lot of the timeline, so what it did is definitely secured, it made it way easier to secure funding. And I think we definitely would have gone to the moon, and maybe it would have been a little slower unless we got a kick in the bum from the Russians achieving a lot. I think that would have really driven the schedule more if they started to really show that they were actually going to meet us. But
One last question.
So were you the research for all this in your mom? Did you do all that research?
I stayed up till 3:30 a.m. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it was a lot of Googling. I mean, especially the internal NASA politics is very shady random text websites that haven't been updated in 2 decades.
Well, that's
but-
wondering because you gave a lot of personal inside information. I wonder how you pick that all up.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is right. So there are some transcripts that you can read of especially those meetings, in the NASA or in the cabinet room. There are a couple transcripts that are pretty famous, but especially the stuff of really internal NASA politics and not politics between NASA and the White House was more hearsay.